talked about the 10 plagues last week. I was excited to take on this week because this is it. If you were to ask an ancient Jewish person, what's the defining moment in Jewish history? More often than not, overwhelmingly more often than not, they would say, oh, that's the Passover. Where are you from and why are you asking that you don't actually know that? Because it was so universally known. Passover has tremendous religious and civic importance, even today in some Jewish communities. We don't really quite have a parallel holiday or a parallel celebration. This would be like if the 4th of July and Christmas happened on the same day and meant the same thing. It's huge. It is their 4th of July. It is their tearing down of the Berlin Wall. It is their Ewok dance party after the rebels blew up the second Death Star. You cannot underestimate the significance of Passover. And Passover refers to two things. The first thing that Passover refers to is, of course, it is the 10th plague. It is the death of the firstborn of Egypt that finally broke Pharaoh's will and allowed the Israelites to leave. But it's also the celebration of that day. So we have two Passover events. There is the actual event of Passover and then also the celebration of Passover. We're going to talk about both of those today. Last week we left off with the plagues, the 10 plagues. We talked about, Aaron mentioned that every plague was set up to oppose and expose the Egyptian god as powerless. You did that fun football analogy where they can't catch it because they're made of rocks, and some of you are like, yeah, I understand. My football team has someone with rocks for hands too. But no, literal rocks for hands, feet, body, and some of you are like, yeah, I understand. I've got someone like that on my football team too. God conquers an Egyptian god with each plague. And after seeing his gods attacked, Pharaoh still did not let the Israelites go. Because you see, Pharaoh is not just the king. He is not president of Egypt. He is the God king. He is a god himself. And the Egyptians, this was a common ancient belief, they believed that the closer a god was to his city, the more powerful he would be. So if you are fighting a battle inside your city, first of all, you probably made some mistakes for it to be there, but you're probably in pretty good shape, right? Like the god of your city is right there. If they're at your walls, you're not going to lose that battle. If you're a mile away from your city, things are a little more iffy. If you're 2 miles away from your city, things are even iffier. If you're 50 miles scaling the walls of another city with another god, things might be a little rough. So the big question was, how good is your God's power's Wi-Fi? Like, if you're in the kitchen and the Wi-Fi's in the living room, you're like, dang it, I can't get it, my God's too weak. I can't open this jar of pickles unless I go into the living room. So Pharaoh is a god on the throne of his kingdom. He is literally in the center of it all. He is where he needs to be. He's saying, okay, this god's off there doing things. I'm the God here. And I'm where I should be. I am in the middle of my own kingdom. You can't touch me here. And the God of Israel, to Egyptian eyes, is far away from home. There may not even be a home. No one remembers where the Israelites came from. And his people, it's laughable to think that this God is powerful, because his people have been here and enslaved for over 400 years. So where's he been? What's he going to do to hurt me? What's he going to do to hurt us? And then comes the 10th and final plague. If you want to follow along, pick up with me in Exodus 11:1. The Lord said to Moses, I will strike Pharaoh and the land of Egypt with one more blow. After that, Pharaoh will let you leave this country. In fact, he will be so eager to get rid of you that he will force you all to leave. In verse 4, Moses has gone to Pharaoh. So Moses said to Pharaoh, Thus says the Lord, about midnight I will go out in the midst of Egypt, and every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sits on his throne, to the firstborn of the slave girl who is behind the handmill, and all the firstborn of the cattle. There shall be a great cry throughout the land of Egypt, such as there never has been nor ever will be. I love this. I changed the translation I usually put on slides for this line. But not a dog shall growl against the people of Israel, either man or beast, so that you may know that the Lord has made a distinction between Egypt and Israel. And all these servants shall come down to me and bow to me, saying, Get out, and all people who follow you. And after that I will go out. And he went out from Pharaoh in hot anger. Some of you have wanted to give that rant, right? Where you leave still angry. You just kind of drop the mic and leave, and they have to think about it. Don't leave this scene without imagining how it would play out. Moses walks. I imagine attendants open giant doors so that he can come in, and he walks up. Pharaoh is up in an elevated position like this, sitting in a high-backed chair. They said that gold was as common as sand in Egypt, surrounded by extravagance and wealth. And in comes Moses, the shepherd. The movie Prince of Egypt sets this up as Moses talking to the man that grew up as his brother. Comes up to him, the most powerful person in the most powerful civilization, in the most powerful spot in the world, and says, My God's going to give you one more chance. Let us go, or this is going to happen. And Pharaoh says, Look around you. Not in my house. You can go. And Moses walks out. Okay, here's where stuff gets neat. And before I move on, my degree is in English literature. When I say stuff gets neat, if you're a little skeptical, I understand. We're going to pick up in Exodus 12. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, This month shall be for you the beginning of months. It will be the first month of the year for you. Tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, every man shall take a lamb according to their father's houses, a lamb for every house. And if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his nearest neighbor can get together. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. And you shall keep it until the 14th day of this month, when the whole of the assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lamb at midnight, at twilight. Then they will take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They will eat the flesh that night, roasted on the fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They will eat it. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roasted, with its head and legs and its inner parts. And you shall let none of it remain until the morning. Anything that remains until the morning you will burn. And in this manner you will eat it. With your belt fastened, and your sandals on your feet, and your staff in hand, and you shall eat in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. When I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you when I strike the land of Egypt. So just a quick review. There's kind of a lot in there, but these are the requirements for your household to be saved. You must take care of the lamb for the first 14 days of the month. So you take this lamb in and you care for it for 2 weeks. This lamb was supposed to be without blemish. It had to be spotless, white as snow. Its bone cannot be broken, so you have to make sure that this lamb is well taken care of, that it doesn't do anything stupid. And sheep are stupid. You need to kill this lamb. Take the blood of the lamb and put it on the doorposts and along the top of the door frame. Eat the lamb and burn the rest. I love this last one. Be ready to go. So look at what this entails. Don't miss this. You must do all of these things. That takes some patient obedience. You have to work at this for 2 weeks. And then finally, you have to be faithful. You have to believe that this is going to happen. You have to get ready to go so that at twilight, after you've killed the lamb and after you've eaten it, so maybe around midnight, sometime early in the morning, you have to be gone. That's how fast this is going to happen. That is how I'm going to work in your life. Are you ready? Because it's happening tonight. How exciting would that be? But also look at all that that requires. There's a lot of faith that has to go into that. God said this, we've been here 430 years and you're telling me to be ready to go in 2 weeks. That's a big ask. We don't often see this through the lens of the people it's happening to right now. But you have to be ready to go. You have to go through these steps carefully and faithfully. Let's jump back into Exodus 12. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive, who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants, and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt. There was not a house where someone was not dead. Then he summoned Moses and Aaron by night and said, Up, go out from among my people, both you and the people of Israel. Go, serve the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds, as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also. I love that last part. That last part is cool. He's so beaten in that last part. He was just boasting 2 weeks before this that you're not going to be able to do that here. Not with me on my throne. Not in my powerful kingdom. And now he's begging them to leave. Saying, don't leave without having your God bless me. Don't leave without helping me rely on the power of the God that I just mocked. The Egyptians were urgent with the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, we shall all be dead. So the people took their dough before it was leavened, before the yeast had gotten into it, their kneading bowls being bound up into cloaks on their shoulders. People of Israel had done as Moses told them. They had asked the Egyptians for gold and for jewelry, for clothing, and the Lord had given the people the favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have what they asked for. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. They don't just leave as slaves. They leave like an army that just conquered the city. With their God toppled, Pharaoh asking for the blessing of the Israelite God, of our God, with riches and spoils that they took from the people. Pharaoh is defeated. God wins. In a victory for the ages. God strikes out against Pharaoh, but God also saves his people. And this is where, especially because we're using this to ramp up into Easter, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention some of the parallels between this and the crucifixion. You see, Christ was crucified on Passover. He was crucified in the same hour when they would have slaughtered the Passover lambs. This is why Paul in 1 Corinthians actually calls Christ the Passover lamb. And some of the prophecies about Christ say, just like the Passover lamb, his bones won't be broken. Breaking the bones was a part of Roman crucifixion. To make sure that you were dead, they would break your legs so that you could no longer push up on the nail in your feet and breathe. You would suffocate in a matter of minutes instead of perhaps the hours that it would still take you to die. But when they came to Christ, they found that he had already died. And so rather than breaking his bones, they put a spear in between his ribs. Water and blood flowed out. And they knew at that point that he had already died. So they never actually broke his bones. And just as the lamb was without blemish, Jesus, it was the perfect lamb that was sacrificed. Jesus, the only person to have lived without sin. Remember, though, Passover refers to two things: the Passover event and the Passover celebration. We need the Passover celebration. God cares deeply about what we celebrate and how we celebrate it. And we know this because he gives a detailed list of instructions for how he wants it celebrated. You see, we lose what we celebrate it if we don't continue, if the way we celebrate it doesn't continue to reflect the thing that we celebrate. That's a convoluted sentence, but how we celebrate reinforces what we celebrate. If you begin to have another person's name on your birthday cake, you have your party at another person's house, and you give presents to other people, we are no longer celebrating the person that had the birthday, are we? It's been a change in how we celebrate. And it's a wonderful thing to celebrate your friends, but we're no longer celebrating the birthday boy or the birthday girl. He spends actually almost as much time describing how to celebrate Passover as he does the Passover event. So the celebration encapsulates several cultural markers and historical reminders that would continually remind the people of Israel of this event. He tells us in Exodus 12:2, this is going to be the first month of the year for you. Your year starts here. Additionally, this day is going to be a memorial day, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations, as a statute forever. You will keep it as a feast. It's Exodus 12:14. These first two establish the importance of Passover in the Jewish community. This is where it began. Just so this is where your year will begin. So that every time a year begins, you're reminded Passover's coming. And you would never skip Passover. All the firstborn son and the firstborn of animals belong to God. Ransoming the firstborn son, now the animals would be sacrificed to God, but the son would not, thankfully, as a firstborn son. He would be ransomed by sacrificing a lamb, as a reminder that God not only ransomed the current generation of Israelites, they were not the only ones rescued in that moment, but he's rescued each successive generation of Israelites in that one decisive moment. You would eat unleavened bread for 7 days and have a feast on the seventh, and you would have to remove all leaven or all yeast from Israel. Now, I'm sure some of you are imagining like, okay, I've baked bread before. I've had the little silver Fleshman's packet of instant rise yeast. That's a lot of little stuff to pick out of a house, okay? And a nation is like, if you've ever spilled one of those, it's there forever. How'd they do? That has to be hyperbole. Well, the yeast was different. They did not have their little silver instant rise packets. What they had instead, they would grow and germinate the yeast inside bread. And as bread rose, they would take a clump of the yeast and set it aside, bake the bread that had already risen, and then the next day they would take their bowl, make their bread, and in order to get the yeast in it so it would rise, they'd take that culture, the lump of bread, of dough from the previous day, and put it in. And that is how they would spread yeast, and how they would keep their bread rising, how they would keep it going. They have to remove it, which means they need to restart that. It's called a starter. Many of you have probably used it. It was much more popular in the first service. And so when they did that, that was another reminder, another generational reminder. It represented sin. During this time, it was a time to remember that we are to repent of our sin. We are to leave our sin behind, or it will continue growing and continue infecting from generation to generation to generation. Just as God has saved generation, we can also transmit that sin generationally, unless we do something about it now. It also reminds them that they had to leave Egypt quickly because bread takes time to rise. You'd kill and eat the Passover lamb. This is a big sacrifice. Obviously, it is a sacrifice, but we don't often think about what would go into the Passover lamb. The Passover lamb would be male, a year old, without blemish, having never broken a bone, and it would live with you for 4 days at least, inside with your family. Now, we've covered that sheep are dumb animals. When you have a dumb animal, and you have to make sure that it doesn't break a bone, doesn't get hurt, you have to take care of this dumb animal in a special way. You have to make sure that it is not in with the other animals and doesn't get stomped on or doesn't get trampled. You have to plan ahead because this has to be a year old. You cannot go out into the field a week before Passover and say, who's unlucky? You. You have to take care of this very specially with the intention of killing it. Oftentimes that would mean taking special care of it for perhaps even more than a year. And if something did happen to it, it was very difficult to replace. So this was a sacrifice because it took time, it took effort, it was a constant reminder of Passover. Every time you fed this lamb, whether it was in a separate pen or in your home, you had to keep it secret. Keep it separate. The Passover lamb reminds us that this is not about us. You prepare a sacrifice all year. Imagine your children get attached to little Lammy. You may even get attached to little Lammy. And then in the end, it's not about you. It still has to be sacrificed. All this may seem really weird, but a few months ago, we either set up a plastic tree or chopped down a real tree, drug it into our house, and put lights on it. So I'm willing to let some stuff fly. But this is all to actually help answer a question. Why? Why do we do this stuff? Why are we taking care of this lamb differently than all the others? Why do we have to begin a new starter for our bread? Why is this the beginning of our month? And in fact, in the traditional Seder meal, the youngest member of the family would ask the father, Father, and Seder meal would be the feast that happens at the end of the unleavened bread. They would ask the father, Father, why is this night different from all others? It is designed to ask that question. Exodus 13:14 says, And when in time your son comes and asks you, What does this mean? You shall say to him, By a strong hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt from the house of slavery. Everything points to what God has done in a proper celebration. The whole Passover celebration is arranged to give God the glory for ransoming Israel out of Egypt. Every year, Jewish families gathered, went through rituals, asked the questions, gave the answers, and I'm sure some years it felt hollow. I'm sure that some years it was really difficult to have Passover without Grandpa asking the questions, and Grandpa leading that meal, and now it's Dad. We know that's different. I'm sure some years Passover hurt, and other years Passover was great. But they did it every year, regardless. Because celebrations remind us of three things. When we celebrate God, we remember what God has done for us. We remember where we've come from. We need to be reminded and thankful of what God has done for us. We live where something like this is legal. We get to meet and rejoice with each other and share each other's burdens and spend time and sing. We don't have to worry about someone coming in the door and breaking it all up. We need to look back on our lives and say, I can see areas in my life where God, in very tangible ways maybe even, saved me. Whether it was from bad decisions, from roads that we really wanted to go down, but we knew God wouldn't want us to. And we need to be thankful for the roads we didn't go down. And be reminded there that God's ways are best. Celebrations give us encouragement in difficult times. Just as the whole Passover and Exodus journey recalls Easter. Exodus echoes throughout Easter. And so we have the crucifixion, which is analogous to the Passover. We have heaven, which is analogous to the promised land that Israel is now making their way towards. Someone lost the map. There was a big whoopsie before they got too far into the wilderness. And the first 40 Passovers were spent wandering, waiting for an unfaithful generation to die, and actually saying, oh my goodness, I wish we were back in Egypt. Things were so much better there. That happens countless times throughout the story of Israel in the wilderness. And I just like to think that the next week was Passover and that person felt real silly. Because in the midst of wandering what was next for them, in the midst of wondering, why do I not feel like I'm making any progress towards where I should be going? First 40 Passovers happened in the wilderness. An entire generation knew Passover as a reminder of what had happened and didn't get to celebrate it in the goal. That's where we are now. We're saved. We're ransomed. We're not yet in heaven. We're not yet to that promised rest awaiting us. And so we wander, and celebrations cause us to remember that it is not about all this wandering that we're doing. It's about God, what He's done for us. And because celebration helps us look toward the future, what He will do for us. We're ransomed for a reason. And celebrations remind us what our purpose is and where we're going in this season of our lives. Because when we look back and we see what God has done and we see how that's played out, you have to be reminded that I didn't know what was going on in the middle of things then. And I don't know what's going on in the middle of things now. But I have to believe that God has something for me in the future then. Celebrating the work of God reminds us that God still works. We need celebrations. We need times that are for us but are about God. We need to look at what God has done for us corporately, together, as a body, but also in our own individual lives. And this is hard. Because so many of our celebrations as a church and also as individuals, it's very hard to keep up the practice of celebrating. So many of them have been forgotten or become so closely tied in with a cultural celebration that it's difficult to tell the two apart. It's hard to see the practices that we need to establish to put our attention on God in the midst of commercials, our own desires, shopping malls, and everything that points us to it being about what's around us. So I have 4 recommendations for starting to correct that. The first is to engage in some of the traditional celebrations of the church. Currently, we're going through Lent. That started Wednesday with our Ash Wednesday service. And Lent is a time when you give something up, give something earthly up, to take on something spiritual and something heavenly. It is a time when, specifically around Lent, we do that to show repentance, to show that we're sorry for what we've done and we're turning away from it. You can give up almost anything for Lent. It does not have to be something negative. It could just be something that takes up a lot of your time. But don't just give something up. Take something on. Adopt a spiritual practice. If you give up Facebook for Lent, spend some time that you would normally spend on Facebook. When you miss Facebook, when you miss being able to see what other people are doing or just to shout an opinion out there, pray. Spend time in the Bible. If you decide to, I'm going to give up a meal once, maybe twice a week. If you're going to give up food, don't jump into something big. Please, that's my medical disclaimer. I feel much better having said that. If you decide that you're going to give up a meal or two, spend that time, spend your lunch break with God. And then when you feel that pang of hunger, pray and say, God, thank you for the times you've sustained me that I haven't seen. Because that hunger is meant to be a constant reminder to us that just as food sustains us, God sustains us, and it's much harder for us to see. So adopt something like Lent. Try it out for a week if 40 days is at first too big a commitment for you. Attend some sort of celebratory service. Now, I almost wanted to say an extra church service, but that's not quite what I meant. We have some services like Ash Wednesday that are set up specifically to celebrate something specific. In the next few weeks, I believe we're going to have a praise service that I am excited about. We're going to meet together as a whole church, sing songs from both services. It's going to be a good time. Keep an eye out for that. And we also have Good Friday coming up, where we meet the Friday of Passover and reflect on what happened that night over 2,000 years ago. Recognize God. Take some time and just say, what have you done in my life that I should thank you for? What do I not think about? What do I now take for granted? Keep a Sabbath. We have 5 days where we work. We have a day where maybe we get to spend with family or work on things around the house. But be disciplined and keep a Sabbath day. That means rest. Focus on your relationship with God rather than your relationship with work or your relationship with your house. This means the dishes might not get done that day. This means your living room may be messy. But take that moment to experience peace despite of all the things. We feel as though we have to be busy all the time. Take time to not be busy. Instead of working on what's around us, work on our relationship with God. We need, now you maybe look at this and say, you don't understand. I can't do that. You should see my living room. I'm not a reflective person. I'm a very future-minded person. That's hard to go back and look back. I barely make it on Sunday morning, and now you're saying more? Or, I really need lunch. I can't give up lunch. Facebook is the only socialization I have. I can't give that up. But we need something to interrupt us. We need something that comes around and jolts us out of our routine. We need something that regularly prepares our hearts and minds to reflect on the work God has done in our past, that He's doing in our present, and what we're looking forward to in the future. We need opportunities to see what we should thank Him for and to thank Him. We need to stop the whirlwind world around us and remind us and help us to focus on the spiritual aspect of our lives. Because you see, Passover was an event. It is a thing, it is something that happened in history. And if they had stopped celebrating it, it would have remained just a thing that happened in history. But the constant reminders meant that Passover was also a thing that happened now. That they were still being saved by God, that they were still being ransomed by God, and they knew that. And if Passover is the analog to the crucifixion, we need to remind ourselves this Easter season that the crucifixion and God's saving work on the cross is not something that was just an event and that just happened over 2,000 years ago. We are still being saved, and we are still being ransomed, and we are still being won over today. That's what celebration has the power to do. To remind us that our God is still working. That we are still works in progress. And that promised land is still there. We pray with me. Father, thank you for what you've done. Thank you for what you are doing. This is hard, God. It is hard to be disciplined. It's hard to take time out of our day when so much calls us in so many different directions. Be merciful with us when we allow the things of this world to get in the way of celebrating you. Help us to see you, to create times of celebration that are not just about us, but that point us and others towards you in our lives and as a church. In your name we pray. Think about those steps. You decide a celebration is a thing you need in your life. You're going to head out today, and the world's going to be the same, moving around at the same speed it has always moved around on. You rise for your blessing. Father, in the midst of our busyness, the chaos of all that is going on in our lives, help us to see you. Help us to celebrate joyously, reflectively, in a way that brings you glory and helps us to love you more.